Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill 2024. Well, the primary purpose of the bill is to amend the Australian Education Act 2013 to enable the Commonwealth share of funding for government schools to be increased. The government says this is all about delivering its election commitment to put every school on a path to full and fair funding under its so-called Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, formerly known as the National School Reform Agreement. However, after 2.5 years under this government, there is still no National School Funding Agreement. There are still no national reforms, and time is running out. The Commonwealth has reached bilateral agreements with the Tasmanian and West Australian governments to lift its contribution to government schools from 20% of the schooling resource standard to 22.5%. For government schools in the Northern Territory, the Commonwealth share will be a much more significant 40% from 2029, recognising the dire challenges facing Territory schools, particularly in remote communities. And in recent days, we have learned that there is now an agreement between the Commonwealth and the ACT. We certainly welcome this certainty. But yet there is no funding deal with the four largest states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. And that means there are no national reforms agreed, as the Education Minister, Mr Clare, promised, so that every child reaches his or her best potential. So what we have, regrettably, instead is a continuing school funding war. And so I say to the government, there is nothing better or fairer about leaving almost 5,500 government schools across the nation. They are the schools in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia, in limbo, which comprises 81% of government schools. With 1 in 3 students failing NAPLAN, there is nothing better or fairer about failing to deliver the national school reforms which are critical to ensuring that every child excels in the classroom and, as I say, reaches his or her best potential. And we know this is a school funding war because on the 21st of August this year, Labor state education ministers came to Canberra and protested against the Albanese government. That was a very big step, I might say, but it indicated the level of animosity and hostility between the states and the ACT and Minister Clare over the failure to conclude this agreement. And that morning, the Victorian Education Minister, Ben Carroll, even declared on ABC Radio that the Liberals did a better job funding public schools when in power than the current government. So this is obviously very embarrassing for the government, and after 2.5 years, given how long the minister has been talking about this agreement, given the fact that this agreement has been extended by 1 year, and then, as I say, it's very regrettable that these deals have not been done, which are, of course, due to expire on the 31st of December. So while the government is proposing in its draft heads of agreement, of course, those heads of agreement have been agreed with some of the jurisdictions, as I've mentioned, while there's been an agreement on a number of, and proposal on a number of important reforms, including evidence-based teaching interventions, screening tests such as the Year 1 phonics and numeracy check, and improved student attendance and performance targets, the reforms are both light on detail and inadequate. The Coalition has been demanding that evidence-based teaching, such as explicit instruction, such as the teaching of phonics, consistent with the evidence, be mandated and be available to every child in every classroom. And it is also time that our hard-working, wonderful committed teachers across this country receive the resources they need to excel in the classroom. Because at the moment, it's a real hodgepodge. And to put a teacher in the position where they are not having access to the best evidence-based materials is really not good enough. And it's only this year, only a number of months ago, that in Victoria, the minister announced, of course, that the Victorian government will move from their sort of whole language, so-called balanced literacy approach to evidence-based phonics, and which is very much founded in the science of reading and learning. And the fact that we have had a generation of children who have been subjected to less than ideal teaching methods, I would call it the era of loose learning, we have failed many students. In fact, really since the 1970s, we have failed Australian children by not giving them the very best evidence-based teaching, by not giving them the resources that we know work, and of course by denying our teachers the very best. And on that note, I really want to commend the work of the Australian Education Research Organisation, established by the former coalition government in agreement with the states and territories, which is leading the charge in demonstrating the very latest evidence-based teaching methods, including providing really practical guides for teachers to support them in matters such as combating classroom disruption. ERO is doing an incredible job. They are running against the tide in terms of what so many teachers have been taught in universities, which are frankly, totally let down teachers by giving them a less than adequate teacher education. It actually has been woeful. And with a couple of exceptions, and La Trobe University is a real standout, generally speaking, our universities have got a lot to answer for in the woefully inadequate teacher training that they have provided over not just years, over decades. So this bill permits but not requires the Commonwealth to increase its share to government schools beyond 20%, with the exception of the Northern Territory, which would receive a 40% share from 2029. These provisions grant the Commonwealth new flexibility in funding arrangements with the states and territories, principally required because of Minister Clare's school funding war and his threat that government schools in the 4 biggest states will miss out on any increase if those states don't sign up to a 22.5% share from the Commonwealth, and of course agreed to contribute 77.5% to the SRS by the end of the year. In fact, that deadline was set at the 30th of September, which has now been slipping. And so, there are, at the moment, more than 80% of government schools facing a situation where they may effectively not get the funding that they deserve from the 1st of January next year. Now, this is no reflection on the newly elected Crucifili government, of course, which is still getting its feet under the table after an overwhelming vote of no confidence in Queensland Labor. But the bottom line is, for students, for teachers, principals and parents, this funding fiasco must be resolved. It is important to note, and I made this very important point in my Senator's statement earlier in the day, the Coalition has a very fine record of backing schools when it was in government. And I say this because I think through the Minister's office, he's issuing points trying to denigrate the Coalition, trying to suggest that the Coalition cuts school funding. It's anything but, because under the former Coalition government, our annual school funding increased from $13 billion a year in 2013 to $25.3 billion a year in 2022. Our Quality Schools package drove record funding of $318.9 billion to all schools between 2018 and 2029. We also strengthened the curriculum with stronger evidence-based content, including teaching phonics, and the science of reading and learning, improved teacher training recommendations. We backed our high-achieving teachers and delivered best practice literacy and numeracy programs to close the gap. Of course, there is more to be done, and we say to the government, please get on with it. I do want to make the important point. Under the current legislated arrangement, the Commonwealth is meeting its SRS obligations of 20% funding to government schools. So it was always misleading for the Albanese government to claim it would fully fund government schools when the Commonwealth was, in fact, meeting its agreed obligations. The shortfall, with the exception of the ACT, was the responsibility of the states and the Northern Territory, which was contributing just 59%, and other poor performers were Queensland at 69% rather than the 80% required, and Victoria at 70%. So it's very important to put that on the record. But at the end of the day, Mr. Acting Deputy President, what's critical is not just the money, but how it is used in the classroom, the difference it makes. And we know on this side of the chamber, and I have to say, to be fair, I think it's well recognised right across this parliament, that raising school standards is crucial because we have seen some really concerning results continuing through the NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program, Literacy and Numeracy Program. 1 in 3 children is not meeting the benchmark standards. 1 in 10 children are so far behind that they need catch-up tutoring. And so there are some very, very significant concerns. Across the 4 NAPLAN test areas of reading, writing, conventions of language, which is spelling, grammar and punctuation and numeracy, Year 9 students fared the worst, with 35.3% failing to reach those at expected standards or minimum standards of proficiency, falling into either the developing or needs additional support categories. It is also, and I've said this before, during the Senate estimates process, it is concerning that ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, claims that these stable results are an important achievement. That really is embarrassing. We are a very smart country. Our children are very smart and we can do best. And with the best evidence-based teaching, with giving teachers the support they need, we can do better. And we know we can do better because even the program for international student assessment shows that 20 years ago, the average Year 10 Australian student was 1 year ahead in their learning compared to now. So we have seen a significant decline, and that is really concerning. As I mentioned, we are concerned that the reforms proposed in the National School Reform Agreement do not include appropriate obligations in relation to combating classroom disruption. Australia has some of the world's most unruliest classrooms, sitting 71st out of 80 countries on the Disciplinary Climate Index in the 2022 PISA results. And we know that when you have disrupted classrooms, children and students and teenagers cannot learn. And it's very regrettable that the government has not responded to the many important recommendations made by the Senate inquiry, led very ably by Senator O'Sullivan into classroom disruption, including a national behaviour survey, a behaviour curriculum, and the clear abolition of open classrooms, which we know simply don't work. We've also raised concerns about the national curriculum not being fit for purpose, and we heard in the bill inquiry, the Senate inquiry into this bill, from primary school principals that it is impossible to teach. And so I believe that more work needs to be done, and it's very regrettable that the government has not tackled that important task. So the Coalition supports this bill, but we are strongly advocating for a back-to-basics education, sharply focused on literacy and numeracy, underpinned by explicit teaching and a knowledge-rich, common-sense curriculum. Thank you.